On May 30, 1967, the eastern skies of Nigeria darkened. The morning dawned over Enugu, but by evening the flag of a new republic, Republic of Biafra, began to fly. Within weeks, federal troops would mobilize. Within months, blockades would begin. Within a year, children would starve in numbers the world had never seen broadcast on television before. For 3 years, from 1967 to 1970, Nigeria tore itself apart in a civil war that killed between 1 and 3 million people, most of them civilians, most of them children, most of them from starvation deliberately inflicted as a weapon of war. This is the story of a war that is barely taught in schools in Nigeria, the trauma that remains unhealed, the voices that have been silenced, but the survivors remember, the orphans remember, the widows also remember. In this edition of Back in History, we explore the Nigerian Civil War known to those who lived through it as the Biafran War. We will see how colonial legacies created fault lines that cracked into violence, how political competition turned into ethnic hatred, how a region tried to break away and form its own country, and how that attempt led to one of Africa's greatest humanitarian disasters of all times. This is not just military history about battles and generals. This is the story of civilians who starved, of children whose bellies swelled from kwashiorkor, of women who became heads of households when their husbands went to war with no hope of returning home, of a generation traumatized by violence and loss that Nigeria has never properly confronted till today. We welcome you to this edition of Back in History. To understand Biafra, we must understand how Nigeria was created. Nigeria is not a natural nation that evolved over centuries. It is a colonial creation, an invention of British imperialism. In 1914, the British forced together the northern and southern protectorates into one colony called Nigeria. This merger combined hundreds of ethnic groups with different languages, religions, cultures, and histories. The three largest groups, Hausa Fulani in the north, Yoruba in the west, and Igbo in the east, had little in common beyond simply being under British rule. The British governed through divide and rule policies, favoring different groups at different times, creating resentments and competitions that would outlast colonialism. When Nigeria gained independence in 1960, these ethnic and regional tensions immediately surfaced. Politics became a competition between regions and ethnic groups rather than between ideas or policies. The North, with the largest population, dominated federal politics. The West had resources and political influence. The East, particularly the Igbos, had education and economic success. Igbo people were prominent in business, civil service, police, and the military. They migrated across Nigeria, establishing businesses and taking professional jobs. This success also bred resentment. Some persons began to see the Igbos as dominating and taking more than their share. On January 15, 1966, young military officers, mostly of Igbo origin, staged Nigeria's first military coup. They killed the Prime Minister, who was from the north, and the premiers of the northern and western regions. They claimed to be ending corruption and tribalism, but because most of the coup plotters were of Igbo origin and most victims were northerners, many Nigerians saw the coup as an Igbo plot to seize power at all costs. Major General Agui Ironsi, an Igbo officer, became head of state of Nigeria. His government, however, lasted only 6 months. On July 29, 1966, northern officers staged a counter-coup, killing Ironsi and many Igbo officers. Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon, a Christian from the Middle Belt, became Nigeria's new head of state. But the counter-coup triggered something far worse than political change. Across northern Nigeria, mobs attacked Igbo civilians. In cities like Kano, Jos, and Zaria, Igbo people were hunted down and killed. Their shops were looted and burnt. Their homes were destroyed. Their women were raped. Children were killed alongside their parents. The violence was so systematic, organized, and targeted specifically at Igbo civilians, most of whom had nothing whatsoever to do with the first military coup. The death toll from these pogroms remains disputed. Conservative estimates say 8,000 Igbos were killed. Others claim the number reached 30,000. What is certain is that roughly 1 million Igbo people fled the north, abandoning properties and businesses, traveling by any means possible back to the eastern region. They came with stories of horror, of neighbors turning on them, of police standing by while mobs killed the Igbo people, of government officials organizing the violence. These refugees arrived traumatized, angry, and convinced that Igbo people could never be safe in Nigeria. The Eastern Region's military governor, Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu, faced impossible choices at this point. The massacres had traumatized his people. Igbos across Nigeria felt threatened. Trust in the federal government was gone. Ojukwu and Eastern leaders increasingly believed that the only way to protect Igbo people was to leave Nigeria entirely. On May 30, 1967, Ojukwu declared that the Eastern region was seceding from Nigeria to become the independent Republic of Biafra, named after the Bight of Biafra along the Atlantic coast. The declaration was both a political calculation and a response to genuine fear. Ojukwu believed Nigeria's structure was broken and that the North would always dominate and that the Igbos would never be fairly treated in Nigeria. He saw secession as protecting Igbo lives and interests, but secession threatened Nigeria's territorial integrity and, crucially, its control over oil. The Eastern region contained most of Nigeria's recently discovered oil fields. Federal leaders knew that losing the East meant losing all revenue that was becoming the foundation of Nigeria's economy. They would not let Biafra go. The federal government declared the secession illegal and prepared for war. General Gowon imposed a blockade on the Eastern region, cutting off supplies and access to the sea. Nigeria had more soldiers, more weapons, and international support, particularly from Britain and the Soviet Union. Biafra had fewer troops, limited weapons, and only few countries, including France and some African nations, providing covert support. The military odds favored Nigeria heavily, but Biafrans believed they were fighting for survival, that defeat meant extermination of the Igbo race. The war began in July 1967 with federal troops advancing into Biafran territory from multiple directions. Early fighting went badly for federal forces. Biafran troops defending their homeland fought fiercely and scored some early victories. The most famous was the Abagana ambush on March 31, 1968, where Biafran forces destroyed a Nigerian military convoy, killing hundreds of soldiers and capturing weapons and vehicles. The ambush became legendary in Biafra memory that their smaller army could defeat the federal forces. But such victories could not overcome Nigeria's advantages in numbers, equipment, and resources. Federal forces gradually captured territories, taking major cities. Enugu, Biafra's capital, fell in October 1967, just 5 months after independence was declared. The Biafran government relocated to Umuahia and later to Owerri, continuing to fight even as their territory shrank. Civilians fled before advancing federal troops, becoming refugees in their own land, moving from town to town, trying to stay ahead of the fighting. The federal blockade was the war's true weapon of mass destruction. Nigeria sealed Biafra's borders, preventing food, medicine, and supplies from entering. They blockaded the coast, preventing ships from reaching Biafran ports. They bombed markets, roads, and infrastructure to disrupt food distribution. Their strategy was clear: starve Biafra into submission. And it worked with horrifying efficiency. In 1968, famine gripped Biafra. With farming disrupted by war, with trade routes blocked, with millions of people displaced, food became scarce and then disappeared entirely. People ate anything they could find: leaves, roots, insects. But it was not enough. Malnutrition became epidemic. Children suffered most. Their bodies consumed themselves, muscles wasting, bellies swelling with kwashiorkor, a disease caused by severe protein deficiency. Their hair turned reddish, their skin developed sores. They became too weak to cry, and then they died, thousands upon thousands of them. This was the first African conflict televised globally. International journalists entered Biafra and filmed the famine. Images of starving children with stick-thin limbs and distended bellies appeared on television screens across Europe and America. The world watched in horror as children died on camera. Relief organizations mobilized, church groups, humanitarian agencies, and concerned citizens raised money and sent supplies to Biafra. But the federal government restricted relief flights, claiming Biafra was using aid deliveries to smuggle weapons. Some aid got through on night flights to makeshift airports, but never enough. The death toll mounted relentlessly. Federal authorities denied using starvation as a weapon, claiming the blockade was a legitimate military tactic and that Biafra's leaders were responsible for continuing the war. But the effect was clear. Civilians, particularly children, were dying in massive numbers, not from bombs, but from hunger deliberately inflicted. Some historians and many Igbo people call this genocide, the intentional destruction of a people. Federal authorities reject the term, insisting it was war, not genocide. But for those who lived through it, who watched children waste away, who buried family members, the distinction offered no comfort. Biafran civilians became both victims and participants in the war efforts. Women ran makeshift hospitals, treating wounded soldiers and sick civilians with minimal supplies. They organized food distribution, trying to stretch meager rations. They became heads of households when their husbands went to fight or died. Orphans multiplied as parents died from starvation or war. Communities organized survival networks, sharing what little they had. The Biafran spirit, or the African spirit known as Ubuntu, the determination to survive and resist, became legendary, but it could not overcome military reality and mass starvation. Foreign involvement complicated the war. European mercenaries, particularly from Germany and Belgium, fought for Biafra, piloting planes and providing military expertise. Some did it for money, others believed in the Biafran cause. Oil companies and Western governments had interest in the conflict. Britain supported the federal government of Nigeria, supplying weapons and diplomatic backing. France quietly supported Biafra, hoping to weaken Anglophone Nigeria and protect French interests in the region. The Soviet Union supplied weapons to Nigeria. Israel helped Biafra. The war became entangled in Cold War politics and economic competition over Nigerian oil. The Biafran propaganda portrayed the conflict as a fight for survival against genocide, rallying international sympathy. Federal propaganda insisted on national unity, portraying Biafra as an illegal rebellion led by ambitious politicians manipulating ethnic grievances. Both sides used propaganda effectively, but Nigeria's control of information and international recognition gave them advantages Biafra could not overcome. By late 1967, Biafra was collapsing. The territory had shrunk to a small area around Owerri. Food was almost gone. The population was starving and exhausted. Military defeat was inevitable. The final federal offensive, Operation Tailwind, began on January 7, 1970. Nigerian forces attacked from all directions, overwhelming Biafra's exhausted, starving defenders. Owerri fell. The only airstrip, Biafra's last link to the outside world, was captured. Biafran forces had no ammunition, no food, no hope. On January 12, 1970, General Ojukwu fled Biafra by plane, leaving to seek support abroad, but effectively abandoning his people. His deputy, Major General Philip Effiong, was left to surrender. On January 15, 1970, Effiong formally surrendered Biafra to federal forces. The Republic of Biafra, which had existed for 31 months, was over. The war had killed between 1 to 3 million people, the vast majority being civilians, the vast majority from starvation. General Gowon declared a policy of no victor, no vanquished, promising reconciliation and reintegration. The federal government pledged to rebuild the East and bring Igbo people back into Nigerian national life. There were no mass reprisals after surrender. Federal troops did not massacre defeated Biafrans. This restraint was important and helped prevent the war from continuing as guerrilla conflict. But reconciliation proved more complicated than slogans suggested. Igbos who had fled before federal troops returned to find their properties occupied, their businesses destroyed, their savings worthless. The Biafran currency they had used was now mere piece of paper. Bank accounts were not honored. Properties were claimed by others, especially in Port Harcourt, River State. The federal government announced that any Igbo person would receive £20 regardless of how much money they had in banks before the war. £20 for a doctor or businessman who had accumulated substantial wealth. This was devastating and heartbreaking. For ordinary people, it was crushing. Entire communities had to start from nothing after the war. The psychological wounds were deeper than economic losses. Families had been destroyed. Children had watched parents starve. Women had been widowed. Orphans numbered in hundreds of thousands. Soldiers returned traumatized by fighting and by what they had seen. Survivors carried memories of horror, of violence, of starvation, of laws that would haunt them for life. But there was no process for dealing with this trauma. No Truth and Reconciliation Commission. No official acknowledgement of suffering. No public mourning or healing process. No public holidays. Instead, there was silence and absolute silence. Nigeria wanted to move on, to forget the war and rebuild national unity. The official narrative became that the war was over, that Nigeria had been preserved, and that everyone should focus on the future rather than dwelling on the past. This meant suppressing discussion of what had happened. In schools, the war is barely taught. In official histories, it was minimized or sanitized. The starvation, the mass death of children, the deliberate use of hunger as a weapon of mass destruction, these uncomfortable truths were buried beneath nationalist narratives about preserving Nigeria's unity, and has been so till today. For the Igbo people, this silence was a second trauma. They had lost family members, property, futures. They had been targeted for violence before the war and had suffered enormously during the war. They needed acknowledgement, justice, healing. Instead, they got told to forget and move on. This unresolved trauma has poisoned relationships between the Igbo people and other Nigerians ever since. Many Igbos feel they have never received justice or full acceptance back into Nigeria. Many see ongoing marginalization in politics and development as continuation of the war by other means. The language around the war remains contested. Some historians and many Igbos describe what happened as genocide, the intentional destruction of Igbo people through starvation and violence. They point to the anti-Igbo pogroms before the war, the deliberate starvation during the war, and the rhetoric from some Nigerian officials about crushing Igbos. Federal authorities and many other Nigerians reject the genocide label. They insist it was a civil war, that both sides committed atrocities, that the federal government's goal was preserving national unity, not exterminating the Igbos. This disagreement is not just academic, it shapes how people understand the war and what they believe Nigeria owes to those who suffered in it. Museums and memorials tell competing stories in Nigeria today. The National War Museum in Umuahia, in the heart of what was Biafra, preserves Biafran memory, displaying weapons, propaganda, and artifacts from the war. It tells the story from a Biafran perspective, honoring those who fought and died for Biafra. Federal museums, on the other hand, tell different stories, emphasizing national unity and the necessity of keeping Nigeria together. These competing narratives show clearly that Nigeria has never agreed on what the war meant or how to remember the war. The untold stories, the voices that were silenced, are gradually emerging. Oral history projects have recorded testimonies from survivors, veterans, civilians who lived through the war. These personal stories reveal the war's human cost in ways that military histories cannot. They tell of children separated from parents and never reunited, of women raped by soldiers from both sides, of young men forced into combat with minimal training and no equipment and left to be exposed to danger, of relief workers who watched helplessly as children died despite their efforts, of mercenaries who fought for money and went home when it was over, of civilians who survived by eating things they never imagined eating, who witnessed horrors they can never forget. Writers have tried to capture Biafra's story. Chinua Achebe, Nigeria's most famous novelist, wrote There Was a Country, a memoir reflecting the war and arguing that Nigeria failed to learn its lessons. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, a younger writer, wrote Half of a Yellow Sun, a novel that introduced many young Nigerians and international readers to the war's human dimensions. These literary works do what official histories cannot. They make readers feel the war's cost in human terms, understand the choices people faced, and recognize that the war's wounds remain unhealed. The oil that was partly why the war was fought has shaped Nigeria's subsequent history. The federal government's determination to keep the eastern region was significantly motivated by oil. After the war, oil revenues exploded during the 70s oil boom, transforming Nigeria's economy, but also entrenching corruption and mismanagement. The Niger Delta, where oil is extracted, has been environmentally devastated and politically volatile. The Igbo homeland, though it contains oil, has seen less developments than might be expected. Many Igbo people see these as continued marginalization, punishment for the attempted succession. Biafran identity persists despite Nigeria's efforts to erase it. For those who lived through the war, Biafra represents a brief moment of self-determination, of fighting for their own nation, of hope crushed but never entirely forgotten. For younger Igbos who never experienced the war, Biafra has become a symbol, sometimes romanticized, of Igbo resistance and dignity. Pro-Biafra movements have periodically emerged, most notably MASOP in the 1990s and IPOP in recent years, demanding either independence or restructuring of Nigeria to give regions more autonomy. The Nigerian government has responded with repression, arresting leaders and sometimes killing protesters, showing that even mentioning Biafra remains politically sensitive in Nigeria. The international community's role during the war remains controversial. Britain's support for the federal government, including supplying weapons used in the war, has been criticized. France's covert support for Biafra was motivated by self-interest rather than humanitarian concern. The United Nations did little to stop the starvation. International relief organizations tried to help but were constrained by both sides. The world watched children starve on television, and while many individuals donated and cared, governments prioritized their interest over humanitarian concerns. This failure to prevent mass civilian death in a televised conflict raised questions about international responsibility that remain relevant today. The lessons of Biafra should be clear, but apparently are not. The war showed how ethnic politics and regional competition can escalate into mass violence. It demonstrated that military conflicts in modern times kill more civilians than soldiers. It proved that starvation is a weapon as deadly as bullets. It revealed how national unity imposed by force creates lasting resentments. It showed that without truth, reconciliation, and justice after conflict, wounds fester rather than heal. Yet, Nigeria has experienced similar patterns repeatedly: ethnic tensions, political violence, military rule, corruption, regional grievances. The country has not learned Biafra's lessons or has chosen to ignore them. For individuals who lived through Biafra, the war never truly ended. They carry memories that shaped their entire lives. They raised children and grandchildren with stories of the war, passing trauma down generations. They see Nigeria through the lens of those years, judging every political development against their experiences of violence and abandonment. Some forgave, some never could. Some tried to forget, some refused to let the world forget. Their stories, the untold stories of Biafra, have finally been heard, documented, preserved. Not in official histories or government museums, but in oral histories, in novels, in memories shared within families, in the insistence of survivors that truth must not be buried. The Republic of Biafra lasted only 31 months, but its shadow has lasted over 50 years. It is the war Nigeria wants to forget but cannot. It is the trauma that was never properly addressed, the injustice that was never rectified, the truth that was suppressed but keeps surfacing. For Nigeria to truly move forward, it must look back honestly at what happened between 1967 and 1970, acknowledge the suffering, learn the lessons, and commit to never allow such horror to happen again. Until then, Biafra still remains not just history, but an open wound, a symbol of what happens when a nation chooses military force over dialogue, unity over justice, silence over truth. The children who starved did not choose this war. The women who were widowed did not choose the war. The orphans did not also choose the war. They were victims of decisions made by politicians and generals, of ethnic hatred cultivated over years, of colonial legacies never properly addressed, of economic interest prioritized over human lives. Their stories deserve to be told, not to reopen old wounds, but to honor their suffering, to learn from their experiences, and to ensure that Nigeria never again allows political disputes to escalate into mass civilian death. That is the responsibility we owe to those who lived through Biafra, to those who died, and to those who carry the scars still. Remember them, learn from them, never forget them. Thanks for watching this edition of Back in History, and do remember to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell for updates on every new video. I remain your friend and host, Dim, bringing you the stories that shaped our nation. Until next time, keep exploring history with us.